Have you reached your absolute breaking point? That point where you simply can't pretend to be okay anymore. Where the facade of strength you've maintained for weeks or months finally cracks and completely crumbles. There comes a specific moment when a strong person finally breaks, not because they can't take it anymore, not because they're weak, but because they've remained strong for so long, carried so much weight, suppressed so much fear, pain, and exhaustion that body and mind simply can't maintain the facade for even a second longer. It's like a dam that holds water for years until a small crack becomes a fissure, and the fissure becomes a complete and inevitable collapse. For her, that moment arrived on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the threats began, 2 days after she was nearly killed in a shootout that left a guard dead and a bullet passing so close she felt its heat brushing against her neck. 6 hours after a meeting where she pretended to federal investigators, the sheriff, and everyone around her that she was okay, that she was holding on, that she could continue being strong for as long as necessary. But the truth she had successfully hidden from everyone was that she was fragmenting from the inside out, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a shell functioning on autopilot while her interior screamed. She had locked herself in the bathroom of the safe house right after the meeting ended, mumbling apologies about needing a shower, about being tired from a long day. She closed the door, locked it, turned the shower water on full blast to muffle the sound, and then allowed herself for the first time in 3 weeks to stop pretending. The crying that came wasn't controlled or silent. It was violent sobs that shook her whole body, that ripped sounds she didn't even know she could make, that released 3 weeks of accumulated terror and exhaustion and despair that she had pushed down, because showing weakness wasn't an option when life depended on appearing capable of testifying, of following instructions, of not being an additional problem. Stay with me until the end, because what happened in that bathroom will show you something fundamental about the difference between performative strength and true strength, between being alone and allowing yourself to be seen. Because she was on the cold tile floor, hugging her knees, her body shaking with an intensity of emotional release she had held back for an impossible amount of time. Water running to mask the sound but not quite succeeding, when she heard a gentle knock on the door. Not the authoritative knocking of someone demanding entry, not the impatient knocking of someone irritated by the delay, but a soft, almost hesitant knock, followed by a voice she had begun to recognize as an anchor in the chaos. "I know you're there, and I know you're not okay." The voice of Sheriff Jake Dawson, the man who had become the only constant in the chaos her life had become, who had been present at every briefing, every change of location, every moment of terror in the last 3 weeks. She froze, a sob caught in her throat, desperately trying to control her breathing, compose herself, rebuild her facade before he realized the full extent of the collapse. But it was too late. He already knew. Of course he knew. He watched, truly watched, in ways others didn't. "Let me in, please." It wasn't a command. It was a request, acknowledging that the choice was hers even when he had the authority to insist, even when she was under his protection. That please, that recognition of her agency, at a time when she had so little control over anything, was what completely broke her. She dragged herself to the door, unlocked it with trembling hands, and opened it just enough. And when Jake sorely saw the utter devastation she had meticulously hidden from everyone for weeks, he didn't flinch. He offered no expression of discomfort or hasty attempt to fix things. He didn't say it's going to be okay or you're strong or any of the empty phrases people say when confronted with pain they don't know how to process. Instead, he went into the cramped bathroom, closed the door behind him for privacy, and simply sat on the floor beside her. He didn't touch her initially, respecting her space even while offering his presence. He just stayed there, solid and present, while she cried out years of forced strength, 3 weeks of contained terror, a lifetime of learning that vulnerability was weakness and that weakness was dangerous. And when the sobs finally subsided to residual trembling, when she could breathe without feeling like she was drowning, Jake did something that changed absolutely everything. He didn't offer empty platitudes or guarantees he couldn't keep. He didn't say the danger had passed when they both knew it hadn't. He didn't downplay her fear or try to convince her she was being irrational. Instead, he offered a promise he had never made to anyone in his 22-year career. Words that cost him something deep and vulnerable to admit. Words that acknowledged that what existed between them had completely transcended the professional. And in that cramped bathroom, with the water still running and her still trembling and the world still dangerous outside, the emotional bond that would define them both was forged. Not in a romantic movie moment, but in a moment of absolute vulnerability, where she finally allowed herself to trust someone completely. But to fully grasp the magnitude of that moment, to understand why Jake's promise was so transformative, you need to know who she was before everything fell apart. Before witnessing a murder she shouldn't have seen. Before her normal life evaporated and was replaced by an existence of constantly looking over her shoulder. Before everything fell apart, she was exactly the kind of person others described as having it all together, not in the sense of a perfect or trouble-free life, but in the sense of someone who functioned, who handled stress with apparent grace, whom others turned to when they needed borrowed strength. At 32, she had built a life that was exactly what she wanted. A job as a nurse in a community hospital that she loved despite grueling shifts, and a salary that would never be impressive. A modest but cozy apartment that she had carefully decorated over the years. A small but loyal circle of friends whom she saw regularly for dinners and movies and soul-stirring conversations. It wasn't an extraordinary life by Instagram or Hollywood movie standards. There were no exotic trips or meteoric careers or fairy tale romances. But it was hers, built through deliberate choices and constant work. And she had appreciated that ordinariness in ways that only people who have lost stability truly understand. There was deep comfort in predictability, knowing that Monday meant day shift, that Wednesday night was dinner with best friend Sarah, that Sunday morning was time for slow coffee and a good book without the pressure of being anywhere. She grew up in a family that emphasized self-sufficiency above almost everything else. A single mother who raised her alone after her father abandoned her when she was 6, never fully explaining why, but leaving a lasting impression that men were unreliable, and that depending on anyone other than oneself was an invitation to inevitable disappointment. Her mother worked jobs for years to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table, modeling by example that strength meant never asking for help, never admitting when overwhelmed, never showing weakness that others could exploit. "You are strong," her mother used to say when she cried after a difficult day at school, after a friend betrayed her, after her first heartbreak. "You don't need anyone but yourself. Remember that." And she did. She internalized it completely. She became the kind of person others saw as a rock, though, one who remained calm during hospital emergencies, who comforted families receiving devastating news, who worked double shifts without complaining, who never seemed to break under pressure that made others crumble. If you've ever been the person everyone turns to but never allows yourself to need someone, if you've ever maintained a facade of strength until it cost you something profound, share in the comments, because recognizing this pattern is the first step to understanding why your breakdown was inevitable. Because strength has a cost that no one sees, especially when you maintain it even when the world around you is literally crumbling. When threats are real and terror is justified, but you keep functioning because the alternative, admitting you can't take it anymore, seems impossible, dangerous, or simply not an option. Colleagues at the hospital saw her exactly that way. "I don't know how you do it," they'd say after a particularly brutal shift where multiple emergencies arrive simultaneously. "You never seem to lose your composure." And she'd smile, accept the compliment, not revealing that composure was carefully maintained performance. That at home after those shifts, she would often sit in the shower, letting the water wash away not only physical dirt but the emotional weight of constantly witnessing human suffering. But that private release valve, those moments alone, where she allowed her guard to lower, minimally depended on having safe space, on having an apartment that was a sanctuary, on having a life that was predictable enough that she could anticipate when she would need those processing moments. And when life imploded, when she witnessed murder and became a target and was thrown into protection where there was no real privacy or safe space or moment where she could lower her guard completely, that valve was sealed. Pressure began to build with no way to release it. If this part resonated with you in any way, if you recognize the pattern of holding on until you can't hold on anymore, leave a like so I know you're connected to this journey. Because what happened to her in the 3 weeks after witnessing that murder wasn't simply about fear of external danger, though that fear was absolutely real and justified. It was about the loss of everything that gave structure to her life, about being ripped from routine, space, and autonomy, about being constantly surrounded by people whose function was to protect her, but which also meant she was never truly alone, never had a private moment to process, break down, or simply exist without a mask. The last 3 weeks had been a test of endurance that she was failing in ways she meticulously concealed. Nightmares every night, not vague and symbolic, but visceral replays of gunshots, of seeing bodies fall, of running expecting to feel a bullet in her back. She would wake up sweating, her heart racing, sometimes screaming, but usually managing to suppress it, so as not to alert guards. Panic attacks during the day that she controlled through breathing techniques learned from YouTube videos. Hiding in bathrooms or bedrooms, waiting until they passed, before emerging with a composed expression. Loss of appetite resulted in a 7-kilo weight loss that her body, already naturally thin, couldn't lose without consequences. Clothes were getting loose. Colleagues, the few she still saw, who vaguely knew she was in a difficult situation, but didn't know the full details, commented with concern. "Are you eating enough?" And she lied. Yes, just stress. But the truth was that her stomach churned at the thought of food. That forcing herself to eat was a Herculean task that she often couldn't complete. And the constant, relentless terror that the assassin who saw her would return to finish the job. Every unfamiliar car was a potential threat. Every person in a parking lot was a possible hitman. Every unexpected sound made her heart race, her hands tremble, and her brain go into fight or flight mode that was exhausting to maintain for minutes, let alone weeks. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories about people maintaining impossible strength until they finally allow themselves to break down with someone who holds on to that space, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because what Jake did when he found her falling apart in that bathroom, the choice he made not to try to fix things, but simply to be there, is rare and precious in ways you need to see unfold completely. But admitting all of this, admitting that she couldn't take it anymore, that she needed help, that her facade of strength was costing her more than she could afford, seemed impossible. Because her mother had taught her that admitting weakness was giving ammunition to others. Because colleagues relied on her strength, and disappointing them felt like betrayal. Because guards and investigators needed her to be a reliable witness, and breaking down could make them question whether she was strong enough to testify eventually. And because Jack the sheriff, who had become a constant presence, who treated her with a respect and consideration that others often forgot, seeing her completely broken seemed to risk losing the only relationship that had begun to mean something real in complete chaos. So she held on. She kept functioning. She kept answering questions in a firm voice. She kept following safety protocols. She kept putting on the face of someone who was handling an impossible situation reasonably well, until she simply couldn't anymore. Until the dam cracked, and that bathroom became a place where years of forced effort finally, inevitably, crumbled completely. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because there is a brutal difference between intellectually understanding that you are under extreme stress, and viscerally feeling, in every cell of your body. The accumulated cost of maintaining a facade of normality when absolutely nothing is normal. When each day is a survival exercise, disguised as routine. For her, those 3 weeks, 21 days that seemed simultaneously an eternity and instantaneous were a brutal masterclass in how a person can continue functioning externally while collapsing internally. In how mind and body can operate in completely different modes until forced synchronization happens explosively and inevitably. 3 weeks. 21 days since witnessing a murder she shouldn't have seen, since the normal life she had so carefully built evaporated in an instant and was replaced by an existence of constantly looking over her shoulder. Of sleeping when she could sleep with a knife under her pillow that she never imagined she would need. Of entering any room and immediately automatically calculating possible escape routes, as if it were second nature instead of the behavior of a traumatized person. The murder had happened in the parking lot of the hospital, where she worked, a place that should have been safe, familiar, mundane. She was leaving a 12-hour shift, exhausted but satisfied in a way that came from knowing she had made a difference. Patients stabilized, families comforted, emergencies managed with the competence that years of experience had honed. She was thinking about nothing more meaningful than what to cook for dinner, when she heard voices, not normal conversation, but a heated argument, a threatening tone that triggered her instincts even before her brain processed specific words. She should have kept walking. She should have gotten in a car and driven away. But there was something about the quality of that pleading voice, "Please. I have a family. I have children," that triggered the crisis-trained nurse response. So she stopped, she turned, and she saw through the space between cars exactly what she shouldn't have seen. A man kneeling, hands raised in supplication, another man standing over him with a gun pointed at him. Shots, quick, professional, without hesitation, body falling, and then worst possible moment in cosmically cruel timing. Her phone rang. Loud, shrill, cheerful music she normally enjoyed, but which, at that moment, was a death sentence. Is someone there? Cold, calculating voice. And she ran, not thinking, just reacting, hearing footsteps behind her, expecting to feel the impact of a bullet any second. Since then, life had been reduced to a series of safe houses, briefings where researchers explained the gravity of the threat she faced, guards whose constant presence was both comforting and claustrophobic, and to maintaining the facade that she was coping, that she was a reliable witness, that the force others had always associated with her was intact, even when the truth was that it was fragmenting in ways she meticulously concealed. The nightmares began the first night and never stopped. Not vague and symbolic, but visceral replays in high definition, the sound of gunshots reverberating in my ears, the image of a falling body replayed in an endless loop, the sensation of running through a parking lot with burning lungs and a pounding heart, and the absolute terror that I wouldn't escape. I would wake up sweating, sometimes screaming, but usually managing to suppress it so as not to alert the guards sleeping in shifts in the next room. I would breathe through panic, wait until my heart rate minimally normalized, then lie awake for the rest of the night because going back to sleep meant going back to those dreams. During the day, panic attacks came without warning. Heart racing from 0 to 100 in seconds. Breathing becoming shallow, rapid, and inadequate, no matter how much air she inhaled. A feeling of unreality as if she were observing her own body from a distance. Hands trembling so violently she had to hide them, usually excusing herself to go to the bathroom where she could lock herself in a stall and wait until it passed. She had downloaded an app that taught breathing techniques for seconds inhaling, 7 holding, 8 exhaling, and used it compulsively, the instructor's calm voice being her only anchor in the tsunami of panic. Food had become the enemy. Her stomach churned at the thought of eating, as if her body had decided that digestion was a luxury she couldn't afford when in constant survival mode. She forced herself to eat because she knew, rationally, that she needed to, but it was a Herculean task that often ended with her pushing away a partially eaten plate. 7 kilos lost in 3 weeks' weight that her already naturally slender body couldn't lose without visible consequences. Clothes becoming loose, face becoming angular in unhealthy ways, and terror. Constant, relentless terror that had become the soundtrack of existence. Every passing car was a potential threat. Every unknown person within the perimeter of the safe house was a possible murderer. Every unexpected sound, a door slamming, a car accelerating. Even a bird hitting a window made the whole body freeze in a fight-or-flight response that was exhausting to maintain for minutes, impossible to sustain for weeks, but which had no choice but to endure because the threat was real. Investigators had confirmed the criminal organization responsible for the murder was sophisticated, well-funded, with a documented history of eliminating witnesses. They weren't amateurs or opportunists. They were professionals who saw her as a problem to be solved, who had considerable resources dedicated to finding her and silencing her permanently before she could testify. The first attempt had come 5 days after the murder, a car bomb that would have killed her if she hadn't decided to walk instead of driving that morning. The second was a shootout on a busy street that killed a guard but missed her by centimeters because he, another guard, whose name she didn't even know, had pushed her back from the car at the exact moment. So terror wasn't paranoia or exaggeration. It was an appropriate response to a real, verified, active threat. But rational knowledge didn't make it any easier to live with that constant level of alertness. That inability to relax, even minimally, because relaxation could mean death. And through it, all nightmares, panic attacks, weight loss, constant terror. She maintained a facade. When investigators asked how she was, she replied, "Fine, considering the circumstances." When guards expressed concern, she reassured them, "I'm holding up." When Jake's sheriff, Jake Dawson, who had taken over her protection after a second attempt and had become a constant presence in the last 2 weeks, looked at her with an expression that suggested he saw more than she let on, she smiled and changed the subject. Because admitting the truth that she couldn't cope, that she was falling apart, that she needed help in ways that went beyond physical protections, seemed impossible for multiple intertwined reasons. Her mother had taught her from a young age that admitting weakness was giving ammunition for others to use against her. That strength meant never needing anyone. That vulnerability was a dangerous luxury that single women couldn't afford. Colleagues at the hospital, the few who vaguely knew she was in a difficult situation but lacked full details because the information was classified, had called occasionally. And each time, she had reassured them that she was fine, that she would return to work as soon as the situation was resolved, maintaining an optimistic tone even as pessimism grew. Because disappointing them, making them question whether the rock they knew was cracking, seemed like a betrayal of the identity she had built over years. And there was a pragmatic fear. If investigators thought she was breaking down psychologically, they would question whether she would be a reliable witness in an eventual trial. If Jake saw the full extent of her fragmentation, he might start treating her as a fragile victim instead of a capable person. Vulnerability could compromise the case, could cause the system to lose confidence in her, could result in everything she had endured being for nothing if she couldn't testify effectively. So she held on. She carried on. It worked. Until Thursday night, 3 weeks after it all began, when a briefing meeting revealed that the case would take at least 6 months, possibly a year, before going to trial. 6 months of living like this. 6 months of constant terror and lack of autonomy and life, suspended indefinitely. And something inside her simply ... broke. Not dramatically during the meeting. She maintained her composure until everyone left. But as soon as she was alone, as soon as the door to the room she occupied in her safe house closed, the dam that had held back the crack began to completely disintegrate. She locked herself in the bathroom, turned on the shower to mask the sound, and allowed for the first time in 3 weeks, for the first time perhaps in years, the facade to crumble completely. Comment below. This makes sense to me. When you hold on to strength for so long, that eventual collapse isn't a question of if, but when. And when it finally happens, it's devastating precisely because you've suppressed it for so long. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a devastating difference between knowing abstractly that you are in danger and viscerally experiencing multiple assassination attempts, between intellectually understanding that a criminal organization wants you dead, and feeling the heat of an explosion that almost killed you. Hearing bullets whizzing by so close that air is displaced around your head. Seeing someone die in your place. For her, that transformation from theoretical knowledge to lived experience happened in 2 brutal weeks that completely redefined her understanding of mortality, of luck, of how fragile the line between life and death really is. The murder she witnessed was not accidental or a crime of passion born of an emotional moment. It was an execution planned, professional, executed with a cold efficiency that suggested experience and zero moral hesitation. She was leaving the hospital after a 12-hour shift that had been particularly intense, 3 cardiovascular emergencies, and near-fatal overdose. A devastated family she had comforted after losing their matriarch. The kind of day that left the body exhausted but the soul strangely satisfied because it knew it had made a tangible difference. It was 10:45 p.m. The parking lot was poorly lit because half the lights had burned out and maintenance hadn't yet replaced them, despite multiple complaints from employees about safety. She was walking with her keys already in hand, a habit of a woman who lives alone, learned through safety articles and unsolicited advice to always be prepared when she heard voices coming from a darker section of the parking lot. Not a normal conversation, a heated argument where one side was clearly threatening and the other pleading. Her initial instinct was to ignore it, move on, not get involved in drama that wasn't her problem. But then she heard a specific plea that cut through her exhaustion and triggered an empathetic response that years as a nurse had honed. Please. I have a family. I have young children. They need me. ... double quotes. She hesitated, turned slightly to assess whether she should call security, whether the situation required intervention. And it was precisely in that moment of hesitation that her life changed irreversibly. The sound of a plea was cut short by a gunshot, not loud like in movies, but a sharp crack followed by an echo that reverberated between cars. Then another shot. Heavy, absolute, terrifying silence. She had frozen completely behind the white van, her body locked in response to primal fear, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too loudly. She heard footsteps, 2 pairs, walking quickly but not running. She heard voices discussing logistics as if they were planning a delivery, not a body position. We need to move him before someone finds him. The van is 2 blocks away, 5 minutes maximum. And then timing that, in retrospect, seemed like a cruel joke of the universe, but at the time was pure unfortunate coincidence. Her phone rang. Not a quiet vibration that would have been manageable. A loud, shrill ring, cheerful pop music that she normally enjoyed but which, at that moment, was a death sentence. Foretold. There's someone there. A cold, male voice, without panic, but with a determination that was more terrifying than anger would have been. Check. She didn't think. Rational thought would have paralyzed her, would have made her calculate the odds of being caught versus escaping. Instead, her body took over, adrenaline flooding her system, survival instinct overriding everything else. She ran, not to the car that was 20 meters away, but to the hospital that was 50 meters away, calculating that security, witnesses, and lockable doors offered a better chance than being trapped in a car while assassins approached. She heard footsteps behind her, faster than her own, gaining ground. She expected to feel the impact of a bullet any second, explosive pain, or perhaps nothing, perhaps just instant darkness, lungs burning, heart pounding so violently it felt like it would explode. Tunnel vision, focused only on the emergency entrance door, which was getting closer, but not fast enough. 20 meters? 15? 10? He went through the door, stumbled, almost fell, shouted in a voice he didn't recognize as his own. "Security, call the police. Someone has been shot." He turned to see a masked figure, black balaclava, dark clothes, completely anonymous, stopping at the entrance. Assessing the situation, security was running. Cameras were recording. Too many witnesses. The killer retreated, disappeared into the night. Security called the police. Paramedics were dispatched to the parking lot, but it was too late. The victim was pronounced dead at the scene. She gave her statement while trembling so violently she could barely hold a cup of water someone offered her. Her words coming out in a disorganized torrent that the detective had to ask her to repeat multiple times. Investigators quickly identified the victim, Daniel Reeves, a 43-year-old accountant, married with 2 children, who was cooperating with a federal investigation into money laundering operated by a sophisticated criminal organization. The murder was not personal. It was professional, the elimination of a witness who knew too much and was willing to testify. And she, a nurse who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, had become a similar problem. A witness who had seen faces, even masked ones, who had heard voices, who could potentially identify the killers if the investigation located them. Police offered immediate protection. Not optional, not negotiable. The organization that did this has resources and a track record, the detective explained. 3 previous witnesses were killed before they could testify. "We're not going to let you be the 4th. A safe house was arranged. Guards were assigned. Promises were made that she would be safe. But promises, she would learn painfully, are fragile when faced with an organization with money, connections, and 0 moral scruples." The first assassination attempt came 5 days later, when routine had begun to seem manageable, when the initial terror had minimally diminished into constant anxiety, but not acute panic. She was about to get into a car, different one from the one she drove before, provided by witness protection, parked in a secure garage at a safe house. She had unlocked it and was opening the door when the guard yelled, "Stop! Don't get in!" A tone of absolute urgency that made her freeze. Bomb squad was called. An explosive device was found connected to the ignition, professionally constructed, designed to detonate when the key was turned, killing anyone in the car instantly. If she had gone in, if the guard hadn't noticed the tiny exposed wire during a routine check, if he had turned on the ignition, but he hadn't. Luck, not skill, had kept her alive. And the realization of how close she had come triggered the first panic attack, which she couldn't completely hide. The second attempt was worse, because it wasn't just almost real, because someone actually died and she saw it and experienced it, and survived by literal inches. 10 days after the bombing, she was being transported to a meeting with prosecutors to discuss the case. Busy street, midday, witnesses everywhere, supposedly safe because it was public. 2 guards with her unmarked car. The shooting came from a motorcycle that appeared from the side, a gunman from behind, firing through a window. Not random spray, but targeted, precise shots. The guard driving yelled, swerved. The guard in the passenger seat pushed her down. Glass. Shattering, deafening sound of gunfire. And then, silence. When she stood up, when she processed the scene, she saw blood. So much blood. The guard who had pushed her, a man of perhaps 30, whose name she didn't even know because the rotation was constant, had taken the bullet meant for her. He was dead before paramedics arrived. He died because he was doing his job. He died in her place. And that realization that people were dying for being associated with her, that witnessing murder had turned her into a walking death sentence for anyone close to her, added a layer of guilt to the terror she already carried. And she understood with devastating clarity, she wasn't just in abstract danger, she was being actively hunted by an organization with considerable resources, professional skill, and a demonstrated willingness to kill not only her, but anyone who stood in their way. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to understand why that moment in the bathroom was so transformative, why the promise Jake made resonated in ways that changed both of their emotional trajectories. You need to know who Jake Dawson was, not just a police officer with a badge, but a man who carried his own scars, his own isolation, his own reasons for recognizing her pain in ways that others couldn't. Jake Dawson had seen fear before. 22 years in law enforcement, starting as a patrol officer at 21, working night shifts in areas where violence was routine, not the exception, progressing through years as a detective investigating everything from petty theft to complex homicides, being elected sheriff of a rural county 6 years ago, through a campaign based on reputation for competence rather than politics, had exposed him to every imaginable variation of human terror. I had seen fear in victims of domestic violence. That specific combination of terror and shame, and sometimes confused love for the abuser. I had seen fear in reluctant witnesses, calculating whether cooperating with the investigation was more dangerous than remaining silent. I had seen fear in parents, receiving the worst possible news about their children. I had seen fear in guilty people being confronted, in innocent people being accused, in all the flavors of humanity under extreme stress. But over the years, Jake had learned to distinguish between types of fear. There was acute fear that passes when the threat is removed, frightening in the moment, but not permanent, not transformative. And there was fear that settles into your bones, that fundamentally changes you, that becomes a constant companion, that alters how you move through the world. The first type heals. The second type you learn to live with, but never truly overcome. She had type 2 diabetes, and Jake recognized it within the first 5 minutes of assuming protective custody of her. He recognized it not only through obvious signs: weight loss, dark circles under her eyes, hypervigilance that made her jump at unexpected sounds, but through a more subtle quality in her eyes, the way she looked through him instead of at him. As if part of her was constantly calculating threats and escape routes, even during seemingly safe conversation. She had been transferred to his jurisdiction after a second assassination attempt in the city. Federal agents argued that a rural safe house would be less accessible to a criminal organization operating primarily in urban areas, and that a local sheriff with intimate knowledge of the terrain, the community, and limited resources would be more effective than standard federal protection that had already failed twice. Jake accepted responsibility without question or negotiation. It was his job. Protecting people in his county was literally his job description. But when he first met her at the police station where a transfer was being coordinated, she sat in an uncomfortable chair surrounded by guards, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes, revealing an exhaustion so profound it seemed etched into her soul. Something shifted from professional to personal responsibility in ways Jake didn't fully recognize at the time, but which in retrospect was clearly a turning point. At 43, Jake had built his entire life around the badge he wore. It hadn't exactly been a conscious choice, more a gradual erosion of everything else, until the badge was the only one left. His marriage had failed 10 years ago, his wife Rebecca citing in divorce, papers that he consistently prioritized career over relationship, creating emotional distance that made the partnership unsustainable. An accusation Jake couldn't deny because it was objectively true. He had repeatedly chosen work over her, canceling birthdays for emergencies, missing important dinners because cases needed attention, being physically present but mentally absent when at home because he was processing investigations. He had no children, not by conscious choice but because the timing was never right. When he was young, he was building his career. When his career was established, he was divorced, and after that, relationships were too complicated, demanding a vulnerability he had forgotten how to offer. He had few close friends, colleagues he respected, but with whom he didn't socialize outside of work. Acquaintances in the community who were cordial but not intimate. His existence revolved entirely around protecting his county, solving problems, being the authority people turned to. Colleagues respected him. Jake had a reputation for being fair, competent, and without nonsense, in ways that made his job easier, Even if they didn't make him particularly beloved, the community trusted him in 82% re-election rate proved it. But there was loneliness that came with living exclusively for work, with having built his identity so completely around a professional role that the person beneath the badge had atrophied in ways Jake only recognized in quiet moments, usually late at night in an empty house. And perhaps that's why recognizing his own isolation reflected in the way she kept everyone at a distance, even while accepting protection. How she interacted politely, but without letting anyone really get close. How she operated in survival mode, which was functioning without connection. Jake felt an affinity that transcended the professional role of protector and protected. She needed, Jake quickly recognized, someone not just to keep her physically safe through protocols and guards and secure homes, but to see her as a complete and complex person, rather than just a witness to be protected or a logistical problem to be managed. And Jake, without planning, without even fully recognizing what he was doing until it was too late to back down, began to be that person. Not through grand theatrical gestures or declarations of care, but through attention to the small details that most people ignored. Remembering, without having to ask, that she drank coffee with milk, but without sugar, that she preferred chamomile tea at night. Noticing when she didn't eat during meals, and gently offering something specific that you knew she liked. Instead of commenting with concern in a way that would create pressure. Respecting when she needed space, when silence was preferable to forced conversation, but being present and available when she seemed to need company or distraction. These were small acts of humanity that cost little but meant a great deal to someone who had been reduced to the status of a protected witness by most people around her. And slowly, over 2 weeks, Jake saw a gradual transformation. She began to see him not as an authority to be obeyed or tolerated, but as a genuine ally. Not as an assigned protector, fulfilling a professional obligation, but as someone who cared in ways that transcended work. Conversations began to drift from purely logistical to personal. She mentioned careers at the hospital, particularly difficult cases, patients she had tried to save but lost. Jake shared cases that haunted him. About a child he couldn't save from an abusive situation because he followed protocol when instinct screamed to act faster. Small but real vulnerabilities, building trust through reciprocity. And Jake began to notice things he probably shouldn't have noticed from a purely professional perspective. The way she twisted her hair when she was nervous, how dry humor occasionally emerged in comments that made him genuinely laugh. How her strength was a performance maintained with heroic effort that was costing her more each day. He began to care not only about her physical safety, but about her emotional well-being, about whether she was sleeping, whether she was processing trauma adequately, whether she had support beyond technical protection. And perhaps he should have recognized the signs that he was crossing the line between professional and personal life. That emotional investment was growing in ways that could compromise judgment. But Jake, who had lived for the badge for so long, who had sacrificed relationships and connections for his career, discovered that he didn't want to back down. That for the first time in years, he was feeling something beyond the satisfaction of a job well done. He was feeling human connection that had become so rare in his life that he had almost forgotten what it was like. So when that Thursday arrived, when the meeting revealed that the case would take at least 6 months, when Jake saw the micro-expression of despair that she quickly but not completely suppressed, he didn't return to his own responsibilities as protocol dictated. He stayed. He waited. He listened to running water for an abnormally long time. And he knocked on the door because instinct isn't professional, but human told him that she needed someone, and he wanted to be that person. Comment below. This makes sense to me when you recognize your own loneliness reflected in someone else and choose to connect even when it would be safer to maintain professional distance. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific moment in any relationship, especially one born in extreme circumstances, where one person's complete vulnerability meets the genuine presence of another. And in that encounter, something fundamental changes. Something that cannot be undone or ignored. A connection that completely transcends the roles or contexts that initially brought them together. For Jake and her, that moment arrived on a Thursday night, in the cramped bathroom of a safe house, where years of her performative strength finally crumbled, and where Jake made the choice not only to witness that crumbling, but to hold space for it in ways that irreversibly changed them both. The turning point came in her third week under his protection, on a Thursday night that began with a routine case progress briefing. Jake had grown accustomed to these briefings. Federal investigators would arrive, present updates, discuss next steps, and leave. She usually participated quietly, answering questions when asked, but not volunteering. Maintaining a professional composure that Jake had begun to recognize as a carefully maintained mask. Progress in that particular briefing was simultaneously good and devastating. Investigators had identified the criminal organization responsibly sophisticated money laundering network, operating across multiple states, with connections extending internationally. They had begun building a case, accumulating evidence, but proving a specific connection to the murder she witnessed required her testimony. And the defense in such complex cases always delayed as much as possible. "How long?" she asked, the first time she'd interrupted a briefing with a question of her own. Her voice was carefully controlled, almost casual. But Jake, who had spent 2 weeks learning to read her nuance, sounded an underlying tension. A federal investigator consulted notes, finding no trace of her eyes when he replied, "Minimum 6 months until trial is scheduled. Possibly a year if the defense manages to delay things. And then there's the trial itself, which can take weeks or months, depending on complexity. 6 months, possibly a year, of living in safe houses, of having life suspended, of existing in limbo, where the past was inaccessible and the future was undefined." Jake saw the impact of those words hit her not dramatically, not with a visible reaction that researchers would notice, but in a micro-expression that lasted a fraction of a second before being suppressed. Absolute despair. The kind that comes from realizing that the impossible situation she was enduring wasn't a sprint but a marathon, with no visible finish line. She nodded, a mechanical movement of her head, not trusting her voice to respond without breaking down. The meeting continued. Logistical details, safety protocols, next steps, she answered when asked, her voice maintaining that carefully neutral quality. But Jake surreally saw the effort it was costing her, the way her hands gripped her knees under the table. How her breathing was too controlled to be natural. How she was holding back collapse through sheer willpower. The meeting ended. Investigators left with promises of updates in a few days. Other guards went to their assigned posts. And she stood up, murmured an apology about being tired, and went to her room in the secure house. The door closed behind her with a soft but definitive click. Jake should have returned to his own responsibilities. He had reports to complete, security rounds to coordinate, a dozen tasks that the county sheriff needed to oversee. But something in her body language, the way her shoulders were too tense, her walk too stiff, her breathing too controlled, triggered an alarm he couldn't ignore. So she stayed. She sat in a chair in the main room, pretending to review paperwork, but actually listening. She heard a bedroom door open. She heard footsteps toward the bathroom. She heard water start running in the shower. Normal up to that point, she often showered after briefings, as if she wanted to wash away the day's stress. But the water didn't stop. It kept running. 10 minutes. 15. 20. Too long to be just a shower, especially considering she was usually efficient, mindful of not wasting limited safe house resources. Jake stood up and walked to her bedroom door. He knocked gently. "Is everything all right in there?" No answer. He tried the doorknob. It wasn't locked. She usually didn't lock it because guards needed access in emergencies. He went in, Saw an empty room, a bathroom with the door closed, water still running. He knocked on the bathroom door, more firmly this time. "I know you're in there. And I know you're not all right." Silence for a moment that seemed like an eternity. Then a muffled sound, a sob she tried to suppress, but which escaped. Nonetheless, followed by another, then another, in a cascade that revealed she had been crying long enough that control had completely evaporated. "Let me in, please." Jake kept his voice gentle, not authoritative. It wasn't an officer's command, but a plea from someone who cared, acknowledging that the choice was hers, even when he technically had the authority to insist. It was that please, that acknowledgement of her agency, at a time when she had so little control over anything that pierced her. Final defenses. She heard movement, shuffling footsteps, a lock being unlocked. The door opened slightly, and the devastation Jake saw when he looked inside was complete. The total collapse she had held back for 3 weeks through superhuman willpower that had finally, inevitably, run out. She sat on the cold tile floor, her back against the wall, hugging her knees to her chest, her whole body shaking with intense sobs that seemed torn from a deep place where she had systematically pushed all. Her terror, exhaustion, and despair. Water was still running in the shower, a futile attempt to mask the sound. Her face was swollen, her eyes red, completely broken in a way that made Jake's heart clench because he recognized that this wasn't simple crying, but the release of a pressure cooker that had been sealed for a dangerously long time. Jake entered, closed the door behind him for privacy, turned off the shower because noise no longer served a purpose. And then he did something that instinct, not training, but humanity dictated. He sat on the floor beside her. He didn't touch her initially, respecting her physical space, even while offering emotional presence. He simply stayed there, solid and present, while she cried with an intensity that was frightening to witness because it revealed a depth of pain she had so effectively hidden. "I can't take it anymore," she sobbed when she finally managed to form words. "I can't stay strong. I can't pretend everything's okay when nothing is okay and won't be okay for months, possibly years, possibly never, because even after trial, they'll hunt me down and I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder and ... double quotes. My breathing became very rapid, very shallow, the beginning of a panic attack superimposed on crying. And I just wanted my life back, my apartment, my job, my patience. This stupid routine of waking up and knowing what's going to happen that day, but I can't have it. I'll never have it back because even when this legally ends, it will never truly end. And I don't know how to live like this and ... double quotes. Words disintegrated into incoherent sobs, her body shaking so violently that Jake worried he might hurt himself. He reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder, light touch offering anchor but not restraint. She reacted immediately, turning and clinging to him as if he were her lifeline, as if his solid presence were the only thing preventing her from completely falling apart. Jake held her, not trying to stop her or console her with empty phrases they both knew were lies. He didn't say it's going to be okay because they didn't know if it would. He didn't say you're strong because strength had been the problem. It had been unsustainable performance that had led to that breakdown. He just held her while she cried. Years of learning that vulnerability was weakness. 3 weeks of sustained terror. A lifetime of training herself to never need anyone. He waited until her sobs gradually subsided, until her breathing became less erratic, until the trembling in her body lessened from violent to residual. And then, when she had enough energy to listen, when the emotional chaos had diminished to a point where words could penetrate, Jake said something that changed absolutely everything between them. "You don't need to be strong with me." A firm but gentle voice, a non-negotiable statement. "You don't need to pretend you're holding on when you're not. You don't need to keep up appearances or protect my feelings or worry that I'll think less of you for breaking down. This," he gestured to the utter devastation she was experiencing, "is a completely normal human response to an impossible situation. And you're not alone in this, not as long as I breathe. You're not alone. These were words Jake had never said to anyone. A promise that cost him something profound to admit, because it signified a commitment that completely transcended the professional sphere. Acknowledging that what he felt for her had crossed the definitive line from designated protector to someone who mattered in ways he could no longer deny or rationalize. And she, hearing that, feeling absolute sincerity in his voice, and in his solid presence that hadn't backed down in the face of her worst, sighed aloud. Herself for the first time in 3 weeks, perhaps for the first time in years, to completely trust someone. Not just accept help, but truly, vulnerably trust that this person wouldn't use weakness against her, wouldn't disappear when things got tough, wouldn't turn her vulnerability into a weapon. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because that night in the bathroom, that moment of absolute vulnerability and transformative promise didn't resolve the external threat that had created this situation, didn't eliminate the escalating danger, didn't suspend the reality that the criminal organization was still actively hunting her. If anything, the emotional intimacy that had developed between Jake and her raised the stakes even higher. Because now it wasn't just about protecting a witness, but about keeping someone who had begun to mean something profound to both of them, alive long enough to have a future they could explore together. That Thursday night marked a fundamental shift in the dynamic between them, from protector and protected to something far more complex and personal. But it also proceeded with cruel timing that seemed cosmically planned to test their resolve, a dramatic escalation in the danger they faced. Because the criminal organization that had tried to kill her twice hadn't given up or moved on to other problems. It had simply become more sophisticated, more determined, more willing to invest considerable resources in locating and eliminating the only witness who could definitively connect them to the murder. 2 days after her breakdown, 2 days that had been marked by a new closeness between them, more honest conversations, the occasional comforting touch that lasted a moment longer than strictly necessary. Glances that communicated more than words, and intelligence arrived that changed everything. Jake was at the police station reviewing reports when a call came in from a federal contact. "We have a problem." We intercepted communications suggesting that a witness's general location has been compromised. Not a specific address, but an area. 5 square miles, that includes their current safe house. Jake felt his stomach drop. How? Commercial drones systematically mapping the area. Electronic surveillance of cell phone signals, even encrypted ones. Traffic volume indicates the presence of a security operation, and possibly an informant, still investigating. But there are indications that someone with access to logistical information may be compromised. It was a nightmare scenario that protocols were designed to prevent, but which happened anyway when faced with an organization with unlimited resources and absolute motivation. Jake processed the implications instantly. If they had a general area of focus, it was only a matter of time, days, maybe hours, before they narrowed it down to a specific location. And when they did, the attempt wouldn't be amateurish like a street shootout. It would be professional, coordinated, designed to eliminate not only her, but anyone protecting her. Jake made a decision in seconds, a decision he knew violated protocol, but which, instinct and growing personal investment dictated, was necessary. "I'm going to move her, today, to a location no one knows. Not even you. That's against procedure." Federal contact began. "The procedure almost killed her twice," Jake interrupted. "And now we know there's possibly a leak. The fewer people who know where she is, including you, the safer she is. I'll keep her in an off-grid location until the threat is neutralized, or a trial takes place, whichever comes first." Silence on the line while the contact processed. "This puts you personally at risk. What if something happens, ... It's my decision." He wasn't interested in debate, or in obtaining permission that he knew would be denied if he formally requested it. Jake had a location in mind even before the call ended. a cabin his family owned in the mountains, inherited from his grandfather, who had used it as a hunting lodge. Isolated, with no public record connecting to Jake, because it was in family trust under a different name, accessible only by a dirt road that most maps didn't show. It had generator electricity, well water, and no traceable grid connections. Perfect for disappearing completely. "I'll go personally," he said when a quick briefing with superiors was called. "No large team that can be tracked or compromised. Just me and her until she threatens to be neutralized." It was a clear breach of protocol. Witness protection required multiple officers, established procedures, and a chain of command. A sheriff alone with a witness in an undisclosed location was a recipe for disaster in multiple ways, professionally, legally, and tactically. "This is madness," the superior said. "If the organization locates you, you're alone against a team of professional assassins." Protocol had a team, and it almost died twice, Jake argued. "The fewer people who know the location, the fewer vulnerabilities, and I know the terrain where I'm going. I have a tactical advantage that a large team wouldn't have." Reluctantly, because the alternative was admitting that the system had completely failed, and that they had no better option, they agreed. On the condition that Jake report his location to exactly one person, a federal contact they both trusted, in a sealed envelope to be opened only in an emergency. The journey to the cabin was tense, in ways that went beyond safety considerations. Jake, driving through indirect routes, constantly checking his rearview mirror, taking random turns to ensure they weren't being followed. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, looking out the window but not really seeing the scenery passing by. Clearly processing that life had been reduced to constantly fleeing, that the stability she longed for was always temporary, always conditional, always a leak or informant away from crumbling again. When they finally arrived, after 3 hours of driving through progressively rural routes, until the road became a dirt trail, and then not even that, just a path through forest that Jake navigated from memory, the cabin appeared through the trees. A rustic but solid structure, aged but well-maintained wood, surrounded by dense forests that offered complete isolation. The nearest neighbors were miles away. No line of sight of roads. No way for anyone to accidentally stumble upon them. Jake parked, quickly checked the perimeter, then helped her carry the limited belongings. She had a backpack of clothes, toiletries, little else because life and shelter didn't allow for accumulating possessions. When they entered, when the door closed behind them and Jake locked it with the heavy deadbolt his grandfather had installed decades ago, she finally broke the silence that had kept her silent for most of the journey. "Why are you doing this?" It wasn't a casual question. It was a question laden with the weight of understanding that Jake had put his career, reputation, possibly his own life at risk by deciding to protect her in this way. Putting himself in danger. Like this, violating protocol, risking everything. Jake could have deflected with a professional response about it being his job, about doing the right thing. But that night in the bathroom, that promise he made had changed the parameters between them. Polite lies or half-truths were no longer an option when she had trusted him with complete vulnerability. So he considered his response carefully, deciding on honesty even knowing that words would definitely cross the line. Because what was wronged about you being punished for witnessing a crime? Having your life destroyed for doing the right thing is intolerable. She began, anchoring herself first in a moral principle that was true but not complete. The system should protect people like you, not fail repeatedly. And because ... he stopped, recognizing that his next words were irreversible, that admitting the truth would change their relationship irreversibly, that he was crossing an ethical line his entire career had been built on respecting. But he looked at her, saw not just a witness, but a person who had begun to mean more than he could rationally explain, and decided that honesty was worth the risk. And because you matter, to me, personally, more than I should professionally, more than is appropriate considering the circumstances, more than I can justify through any rationalization about simply doing a job correctly. You matter in a way that completely transcends distinction. A confession hung between them in the cabin air, words that couldn't be undone, a truth that changed everything. She could have backed away, she could have created the appropriate distance, she could have reminded him of the professional role he should maintain. Instead, she crossed the space between them, stopped close enough that Jake could see details of her eyes, tiredness, but also something more. "You matter to me too," she said quietly but firmly. "More than I can explain or justify considering how long we've known each other, considering the circumstances, considering that I know part of it might be gratitude or trauma bond or any other psychological term for a connection born in crisis. But I don't care about terms. I just know you matter." It was a mutual recognition that what had grown between them beginning, with his attention to small details, deepening through vulnerable conversations, solidifying that night when he held her as she crumbled, completely transcended the circumstance that had thrown them together. It was real, it was complicated, it was professionally inappropriate, and it was undeniable. And in that isolated cabin, with danger still real but temporarily distant, they both understood. They had crossed a point of no return. And what would come next would be a test, not only of physical survival, but of whether the connection forged in vulnerability and crisis could translate into something sustainable when if life returned to normal. Comment below. This makes sense to me. When you risk everything for someone, and they recognize and reciprocate the feeling. The boundary between professional and personal life not only blurs but disappears completely. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a brutal difference between making a decision in the heat of the moment based on instinct and necessity, and living with that decision during days of isolation, where you have infinite time to question every motivation, to dissect every choice, to confront the uncomfortable truth that perhaps, just perhaps, the reasons you tell yourself aren't entirely honest. For Jake, those first days in the cabin were as much about protecting her physically as they were about an internal battle with his own conscience, about whether he was doing the right thing for the right reasons. The isolation in the cabin forced Jake to confront the full reality of what he had done in ways that the action hadn't allowed time to process. During the drive to the cabin, during the initial security setup, during the first few hours ensuring the perimeter was secure, adrenaline and tactical focus had kept doubts at bay. But when night fell that first day, as she slept in the small room Jake had assigned to her, as he sat in a chair near the window, keeping watch, which would be their standard, his mind began to process the full magnitude of the decision he had made. He had, in technical terms, effectively kidnapped a federal witness. Not maliciously, not with the intention of compromising the case or helping her escape legal obligation, but definitely, unequivocally outside of established protocols that existed for specific reasons: accountability, oversight, protection against exactly the kind of situation Jake had created, where a lone officer had complete control over a vulnerable witness. His superiors knew he had moved her. They knew the general direction, northern mountains, rural area, but they didn't know the exact location. Jake had provided coordinates in a sealed envelope with instructions to open only in an emergency, but for practical purposes, he had removed her from chain of custody, from a protection system, from any form of external verification. Other federal investigators were frustrated. Jake knew through brief calls he made on a secure phone in the nearest town, 20 miles away. They wanted access to her to prepare testimony, to review evidence, to ensure the case was being built properly. But Jake blocked them, arguing that minimizing movement was essential for security, that virtual meetings were compromised, that they had time before trial, and he was alone with her, professional boundaries that he should have kept completely, irreversibly obliterated, not only through mutual confessions on the day they arrived, but through the forced proximity that came from sharing a small space, from being the only two people for miles, from the mutual dependence that the situation created. At night, when she tried to sleep, because nightmares still came frequently, muffled screams that made Jake check on her but not wake her, unless she seemed trapped in a loop she couldn't escape. He kept watch. Jake questioned motivations with the brutal honesty that solitude allowed. Was it really about keeping her safer? The tactical argument was sound. Fewer people knowing her location meant fewer potential targets. Geographic isolation made approach difficult for assassins, even if the location leaked, and his knowledge of the terrain offered defensive advantages. Objectively, rationally, the decision made sense from a purely security perspective. But was it only about safety? Or was it also perhaps primarily about wanting alone time with her? About having developed feelings that he recognized but hadn't fully admitted the scope of? About creating a situation where the connection that had begun could deepen without external interference or judgment from colleagues who would question its appropriateness? If the situation were objectively reviewed by a third party, by an ethics investigator, by a supervisory board, by anyone without knowledge of the emotional context, what would it look like? A 43-year-old sheriff with a history of emotional isolation and lack of meaningful relationships removes a vulnerable witness in her 20s from appropriate supervision, takes her to a remote location, spends days alone with her while clearly developing an emotional involvement that compromises professional judgment. It seemed problematic at best, predatory at worst. And Jake, who had spent his career building a reputation for integrity, who had judged other officers for minor violations, had to confront the possibility that he was being exactly the kind of officer he had always despised, one who used authority to create situations serving personal interests disguised as professional necessity. But each time he questioned one, he questioned constantly during those nightly vigils, during moments when she was busy and he had the mental space for brutal self-reflection. He returned to the same conclusions that allowed him to continue. First, the protocol had failed. Objectively, verifiably, almost fatally, twice. The system that was supposed to protect her had leaks, vulnerabilities, and had proven inadequate for the threat they faced. This wasn't Jake being paranoid or making up excuses. It was documented reality. Second, isolation was objectively the safest option. Given the circumstances, fewer points of failure, fewer people to compromise, terrain that favored defense over attack. Even if his motivations were mixed, and they were, he couldn't deny that to himself. The result was correct. She was safer in the cabin than in any alternative arrangement the system could offer. Third, she had chosen to trust him. Not blindly, not without options. Jake had explained the risks, had been honest about protocol violations, about the implications of isolation, and she had agreed, had said she trusted his judgment more than she trusted a system that had repeatedly failed. Her agency mattered, and she had exercised that agency by choosing to stay. But there was a personal cost that Jake hadn't fully anticipated. A cost that went beyond the career ramifications that would eventually come when all of this was reviewed. The cost was emotional. It was a transformation happening in real time that he was aware of but unable to stop. Forced proximity to her days that turned into weeks, conversations that started about logistics but veered into personal matters. Shared vulnerability stemming from being the only two people in a limited world. Seeing her not as an abstract witness, but as a complex, intelligent, funny person when she allowed humor to emerge. Strong, but allowing herself to be vulnerable, specifically with him, was transforming feelings of professional importance into something much deeper and more terrifying. He was falling in love, or perhaps he had already fallen in love, and was only now recognizing its magnitude. As distance and distraction were impossible. And he knew intellectual knowledge that didn't change emotional reality, that he was playing with fire in multiple ways. The relationship between protector and protected person born from trauma rarely translated into something healthy or sustainable after the crisis passed. There was research. There were historical cases. there were reasons why protocols existed against precisely this. Power dynamics were inherently problematic. They depended on it for literal security, for survival. How to distinguish genuine feelings of gratitude, or trauma bond, or Florence Nightingale effect, or any other psychological term for connection that seemed real at the moment, but evaporated when circumstances changed. And there was the question of whether Jake was using the situation, consciously or unconsciously, to satisfy his own emotional needs that he had neglected for years. He was lonely. His life had been built entirely around work. He hadn't had meaningful relationships in decades. And here was the person who needed him, who looked at him with gratitude and growing affection, who filled a void he had learned to ignore because confronting it was too painful. Was it genuine, or was Jake taking advantage of a situation he created, even if that exploitation wasn't conscious or malicious? But intellectual knowledge, valid doubts, constant self-questioning, none of that changed the emotional reality that grew more undeniable each day. She had become the most important person in his life, not just because of forced proximity or lack of alternatives, but because in ways that transcended logic, she saw him in ways no one else did. Understood his isolation because she shared his own version of himself, provoked laughter he had forgotten how he felt. Made what should have been just a temporary hideout feel like home for the first time in years. The idea of something happening to her, of the organization locating the cabin, of his failure to protect her, resulting in her death, of the trial eventually ending and her returning to a life where he had no place, was intolerable in a way that completely transcended professional duty or even moral responsibility. It was personal, it was profound, and it was complicated in ways Jake didn't have answers for. Only the recognition that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, that whatever happened next, professionally, legally, emotionally, he would have to deal with the consequences of choosing her over protocol, connection over appropriate distance, heart over head. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific transformation that happens when two people are forced by circumstance to exist in a bubble, completely separate from the outside world, where normal distractions and social roles and masks that we maintain to navigate life are gradually stripped away until only raw humanity remains, honest vulnerability, a connection that cannot be rationalized or denied. For Jake and her, that transformation happened during days in the cabin that merged into a routine that was simultaneously mundane and profoundly intimate, where final boundaries between protector and protected, between sheriff and witness, between strangers thrown together by trauma and people consciously choosing each other completely dissolved. The days in the cabin acquired their own rhythm, a structure that emerged organically from practical needs, but created a framework for emotional depth that neither of them had experienced in years, perhaps never with that particular intensity. Mornings began early, Jake waking with dawn, a habit of decades, even when there was no formal shift to begin. He checked the perimeter while she was still asleep, walking a circuit around the cabin he had memorized, looking for signs of intrusion or surveillance, confirming that their isolation remained intact. When he returned, he would usually find her awake, making coffee in an old percolator that Jake's grandfather had left behind, the aroma filling the small cabin in a way that made the rustic space feel like home. They would drink coffee together in the early morning silence, comfortable rather than awkward, the kind of quiet that only people who trust each other can share, without feeling the need to fill it with unnecessary conversation. Then came practical activities that Jake had instituted not only for their usefulness, but because he recognized that giving her a sense of agency, of capability, helped combat the feeling of powerlessness that came from having her life completely out of control. He taught her basic self-defense skills, not because he realistically expected her to need to fight off professional killers, but because knowing that she could defend herself minimally, that she wasn't completely vulnerable, restored a fragment of confidence that trauma had eroded. If someone grabs you like this, He demonstrated, moving slowly, always asking permission before touching. Always aware that non-consensual touch would be a trigger after what she had experienced. You twist like this, use their weight against them, create space to run. The goal is never to win the fight. It's to create an opportunity to escape. She learned quickly, her body recalling the coordination that years as a nurse job that demanded precise movement under pressure had developed. And Jake saw a transformation happen session by session, her posture becoming more confident. The hypervigilance that made her jump at unexpected sounds diminishing minimally as she gained the mental and physical tools to feel less utterly powerless. Afternoons usually involved maintenance, tasks chopping firewood, because the generator was a backup but the fireplace heated the cabin more efficiently. Tending to the small garden she had started because she needed activity. That was creative rather than just reactive. Minor repairs the cabin always needed. Physical work that kept her hands busy and allowed conversations to flow naturally from superficial to deep without the intensity of sitting face to face, forcing intimacy. She cooked meals they shared, using limited ingredients that Jake sourced weekly from the nearest town, but finding creativity within restrictions. I learned to cook from my mother, she explained one evening while preparing a simple but surprisingly flavorful soup. She worked 2 jobs, came home exhausted, but always insisted we have dinner together. She said that sharing a meal was a way to remember that we weren't just surviving, but living. Jake watched her cook, noticing the grace in movements that came from years of practice, and felt a pang in his chestnut pain, but a realization of how much he had missed living alone for so long, how much isolation it had cost him in terms of simple yet profound moments like that. Dinners were where conversations truly deepened. No TV, no internet, no distractions other than each other. They talked. Not superficially, not engaging in polite small talk, but exploring stories, wounds, hopes they rarely shared with anyone. She would talk about patients she had tried to save but lost, about how she carried each death in ways that colleagues seemed able to compartmentalize but she couldn't. There's a patient, Michael, 52, massive heart attack that I fought for 40 minutes to resuscitate. I managed to bring him back twice, but lost him the 3rd time. And his wife was out there, waiting, hopeful, and I had to tell her I couldn't, that he was gone. And I saw hope die in her eyes. And I carried that for months. Jake shared stories about cases that haunted him, about children in situations of domestic abuse that he had investigated but where he couldn't act quickly enough, where protocol and bureaucracy delayed intervention until it was too late. 7 years old. She was 7 years old. And I knew damn instinct screamed that I needed to get her out of that house immediately. But the evidence wasn't enough yet. Social services needed proper process. And while I was following protocol like a good police officer, she died. These were vulnerabilities that none of them readily shared, wounds that they usually hid beneath professionalism or performative strength. But in the booth, in isolation that rendered masks unnecessary and useless, they allowed themselves to be seen completely. Evenings, their favorite time of day, were spent on a small balcony when the weather permitted, or near the fireplace when it didn't. The sky in the mountains, free from the light pollution of the city, was a spectacle that never aged stars in impossible density. The Milky Way visible as a luminous band, occasionally a meteor streaking through the darkness. "You've changed," she observed one night, as they sat side by side, shoulders lightly touching, sharing warmth against the altitude chill, since we met. Less formal, less ... armored, more human. Jake considered, laughing without humor, but with sincerity. A badge is armor. I realized that years ago, but never questioned whether it was a problem. It makes it easier to do the job when you maintain distance. When you see people as cases instead of individuals. When you don't let emotions compromise judgment. But with you, ... double quotes, he paused, searching for the right words. I can't keep my distance. From you, technically I still should array, still a witness. I'm still the designated protector. But for weeks I haven't seen you that way. I see a person. I see a woman I admire for her genuine strength, which isn't a performance but a daily choice to keep going, despite everything. And I don't want to keep my distance. I don't want a distinction between us. Why? A genuine question, not a test, but real curiosity about his motivation. Because you remind me that there is life beyond work. Jake replied, an honesty that cost him something to admit. That isolation I chose, which I rationalized as necessary, as protection against distractions, wasn't a fortress, but a prison. It kept the world out, but also imprisoned me within a version of myself that was functional, but not ... complete. He stopped. A decision being made in real time about how much to reveal, about crossing a final line that would make it impossible to back down. And because I fell in love with you, I didn't plan it. Honestly, I tried not to, because I know it's complicated and probably inappropriate, and will definitely have professional consequences when all this is reviewed. But it's true. I fell in love with you. The silence that followed was dense, heavy, both aware that words could not be undone. She could have created distance, recalled professional appropriation, self-protective, emotional self-care. Instead, she turned to look directly at him, her eyes reflecting starlight. Me too, she said simply, but with absolute conviction. I fell in love with you. And I know what I should do question whether it's real, whether it's a trauma bond, or gratitude mistaken for love, whether it's the Florence Nightingale effect, or any other term therapy taught me about connections born in crisis. But I don't question it, because I know the difference between feeling obligated and choosing. I know the difference between needing someone for survival and wanting someone because they make you feel more like yourself than you have in years. She took his hand, intertwined their fingers, a touch that was a choice, not a necessity. And I choose you. Fully aware of the complications, the risks, how this might look to others, I choose you. And in that moment, under a starry sky in isolation that was simultaneously refuge and prison, they allowed themselves something they had both avoided, even when it was obvious where they were going. Jake leaning in, her finding her halfway, a kiss that began gently, almost hesitant, but deepened as years of solitude and weeks of growing closeness found release. It wasn't just a kiss. It was an acknowledgement of feelings, a promise that what existed between them, complicated, inconvenient, professionally inappropriate, was worth fighting for. Worth the consequences that would come, worth the risk to their hearts that they had both protected so carefully for so long. Comment below. This makes sense to me when isolation forces you to be real, and the connection that emerges is more honest than anything built with intact social masks. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a cruel irony in how sometimes the thing you most desire is illusion of a threat, return to safety, end of an impossible circumstance, when it finally arrives, brings not only relief, but also devastating loss. Because the extraordinary circumstance that forced closeness also protected the nascent relationship from outside scrutiny. For Jake and her, news that should have been pure celebration became a bittersweet moment where victory revealed the vulnerability of what they had built. The breakthrough in the case came 2 weeks after they moved into the cabin. 2 weeks that had been a bubble out of time where their relationship deepened from initial confessions to genuine intimacy, not just physical, but emotional intimacy of the kind that comes from repeatedly choosing vulnerability, from being fully seen and accepted. Jake had gone to town for his weekly check-in when a call came in from a federal contact. We have him, leader of the organization, arrested in an unrelated drug operation. When he realized he was being arrested, he offered information about money laundering. He confessed everything, trying to make a deal. Jake felt a wave of relief and apprehension. Structure falling apart. With the leader arrested, others were prosecuted or fled. Organization neutralized. Threat to the witness drastically reduced. She can return to life with reasonable precautions, but without 24/7 protection. It should have been a celebration. But Jake felt a pang in his stomach, recognizing that their time in isolation was coming to an end. An ending meant confronting reality. How could a relationship born in extraordinary circumstances survive when those circumstances changed? When he arrived at the cabin, he found her in the garden. She looked up when she heard the car, her smile changing as she read his body language. What happened? They caught the leader. He's confessing. The structure is crumbling. You're safe. You can go back to your life. She sat down heavily. Then it's over. Threat. Majority. I didn't mean threat. I meant this. We. Jake sat down beside her. It doesn't have to end, but it changes. What do we do now? Jake was honest. You go back to life. You resume work, rebuild your routine, and I face the consequences of violating protocol. There will be an investigation. Probably. Suspension. Possibly loss of badge. Because of me, it was my choice. I did the math. I knew the risks. I would do it again. Silence. Then she asked, and us? Did we find out if this is real outside the cabin? I know it's real, Jake said. I have no doubt, but the world won't see it that way. They'll see the sheriff as someone who got involved inappropriately with a vulnerable witness. You didn't do that, I know. You know. But how can I prove it? There will be an investigation into the decision to bring you here. They'll ask about our relationship. And I'm not going to lie, so we don't count. That's not how it works. Discovering lies would only make things worse. It was integrity that she loved, but also what could destroy his career. It's not fair, she said. You saved me, and you're going to be punished. We'll be honest, Jake said firmly. We'll face investigation. We'll accept the consequences. We'll find out if what we have survives scrutiny. What if I can't resist? Then we'll know. I prefer to find out now, confronting it together. But I believe this is real. How much time do we have? Days, maybe a week. So let's not waste time regretting. Decisions solidifying. Just us being completely honest about what we want. What do you want? You. The future is with you. Willing to fight through any investigation, any trial. Absolute resolve. Because you taught me the difference between performative strength and true strength. I won't give that up. And in those final days in the cabin, before the world returned with complications, they allowed themselves to fully experience the connection they had built, memorizing moments because they recognized that what was to come would be a test. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a devastating truth about promises made in times of crisis versus promises kept when the crisis passes and the real world returns with all its complications, judgments, and consequences that didn't exist in the protected bubble of isolation. For Jake and her, those last days in the cabin before returning to reality were as much about memorizing moments of pure connection as they were about strengthening resolves for what they knew was coming, a test that would determine if what they had built was strong enough to survive the scrutiny of a system that wasn't going to be kind or understanding. Because there's a fundamental difference between a promise made in a calm moment, when stakes are low and words cost little, and a promise made when someone is completely falling apart. When they see the person they care about fragmented and choose not to flee to comfort and distance but to hold on to the pieces, literally and metaphorically, until they can begin to put them back together. Jake had seen her at the worst possible moment, not just scared, but destroyed. Not just vulnerable, but operating in survival mode that was costing her sanity. Not just broken, but already broken and desperately trying to hide the extent of the damage from everyone around her. And when he found her in that cramped bathroom, water running to mask sobs she could no longer control, her body shaking with the release of 3 weeks of pent-up terror, he hadn't offered theatrical salvation or empty promises that everything would be all right when they both knew they didn't know if it would. He had offered simple, honest presence. Words that cost him something profound to admit. You're not alone in this. Not while I breathe. You don't have to be strong with me. You don't have to pretend. That promise, made on the cold tile floor while she wept, After years of learning that vulnerability was weakness, and that strength meant never needing anyone, had irreversibly changed everything between them. Not because it solved external problems, the threat was still real, danger still lurked, her life was still suspended, and not because it eliminated pain or trauma. Those were the work of months or years of therapy, not a single moment of recognition. But because for the first time since everything fell apart, possibly for the first time in her entire adult life, she had allowed herself to completely trust someone, had chosen vulnerability with a specific person, and discovered that this person hadn't used weakness against her, hadn't disappeared when things got tough, hadn't turned moments of breakdown into weapons or manipulation. And in the days that followed, days of learning about each other in an isolated cabin, of conversations that revealed layers that normally take months or years to emerge, of building intimacy through shared vulnerability and a consistent choice of honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, that initial promise had been reinforced repeatedly, not through words, but through actions. Jake keeping watch so she could sleep without constant terror. She cooking meals that transformed the cabin into a temporary home. Both choosing to be present for each other in ways that went beyond obligation or necessity, into territory of genuine care and growing love. But now, with news that the threat had diminished, that she could return to life, that their time in isolation was ending, that promise and the relationship built around it was about to be tested in ways neither of them had fully anticipated when they were safe in a protected bubble, where the outside world was a distant abstraction. Because discovering you love someone in isolation, when it's just the two of you against the world, when extraordinary circumstances accelerate intimacy and create an intensity that normal life rarely allows, is relatively easy. Not easy in the sense of being painless or uncomplicated, but easy in the sense that there are no competing distractions, no external judgment penetrating, no social or professional consequences forcing a confrontation with the reality that the relationship was born under conditions that most would consider problematic. But to choose that love when the world returns, with all its complications, when careers are literally at stake, and Jake faces an investigation that could end in the loss of the badge he's carried for 22 years, when families eventually discover and question the appropriateness of the relationship between protector and protected, when colleagues murmur about emotional compromise and abuse of authority, when the entire system Jake had loyally served suggests he had compromised fundamental integrity, that he had used his position to create a situation serving personal interests even if his intentions weren't malicious, that was a real test. That would reveal whether a promise made in a moment of absolute vulnerability had the substance to survive the merciless reality of judgment, consequence, and pressure to back down, rationalize, and protect one's own interests over maintaining a commitment to another person. And Jake and she, spending those last precious days in the cabin, before the world returned, both understood the magnitude of what they faced. Not naively, not with foolish optimism that love conquers all, but with sober recognition that they had chosen a difficult path, that there would be a real and tangible cost, that a test was coming. When the investigation begins, Jake said the last night before they left the cabin, sitting on the balcony under stars that had become silent witnesses to their transformation, they're going to ask about the nature of our relationship. They're going to look for evidence of inappropriateness, that I used my authority to manipulate or coerce. And every moment of intimacy, every choice to be together, will be examined through a less generous lens. I know, she replied quietly. And I'll tell the truth that I chose you freely, that I never felt coerced or manipulated, that you respected my agency even when you had the authority not to. I will defend you and us even when others question us. It's going to cost. You, Jake warned. Not just me, but you, too. There will be people suggesting you have Stockholm Syndrome, that you've confused gratitude with love, that you can't distinguish genuine connection from trauma bonding. They'll question your judgment and your mental health. Let them question, she said firmly. I've spent my whole life proving my strength by never needing anyone. I learned from you that true strength is allowing yourself to be vulnerable with the right person. It's choosing to trust even when it's risky. I'm not going to back down from that lesson now that it's inconvenient. And at that moment, Jake understood that what they had complicated, born of trauma, professionally inappropriate, real in ways that transcended all those complications, was worth fighting for, not despite the difficulties, but including them. Because the test would reveal whether the foundation was solid or built on sands of circumstance that would evaporate when circumstances changed. On the morning they left the cabin, carrying their limited belongings back to the car, they both turned for one last look at the structure that had been both refuge and prison, and the place where their relationship was born. Not sentimentally, not with the illusion that they could preserve what they had there indefinitely, but with gratitude for having had that time, that space, that opportunity to know each other without masks or distractions. "Ready?" Jake asked, hand outstretched. "No," she admitted honestly, "but I'll go anyway. With you." And as they drove back to reality towards debriefings and investigations and consequences and judgment and everything that came with having chosen each other in circumstances the world wouldn't easily understand or approve of, they both carried not only memories of days in the cabin, but resolve forged in the recognition that a promise made in a moment of absolute vulnerability was worth keeping even when it cost everything. Because some connections transcend convenience, or social appropriation, or career considerations, and what they had was one of those. The test was only beginning, and only time would reveal whether love born in crisis could not only survive but thrive when the crisis passed, and reality demanded that they choose each other repeatedly in the face of pressure to retreat, to rationalize it as an error of judgment born of extreme circumstance, to protect their own interests over honoring a connection that had become more important than any badge or reputation or approval from a system they would never fully understand. If you've made it this far with me, if you felt every second of this journey of vulnerability transformed into trust, if you've understood the devastating difference between a promise made in a calm moment and a promise made when someone is completely broken, and you choose not to run away but to hold the pieces together, then you know this story is about something much deeper than romance born in crisis. It's about recognizing that true strength isn't about never breaking, but about allowing yourself to break with the right person. It's about choosing vulnerability, even when everything you've learned says vulnerability is dangerous. It's about trusting that someone will make space for your pain without using that pain against you. And look, if this kind of story resonates with you, if you want to continue exploring these journeys, where people find connection not in perfect moments but in the trenches of trauma, where love is born not despite impossible circumstances but through them, where promises made when someone is falling apart are tested when the world returns with relentless judgment, then signing up here is the way to continue walking with me. Because I create each script thinking of you, someone who understands that the deepest connections are not those built in ideal conditions, but those forged when masks fall and absolute vulnerability meets genuine presence. Comment below. I'm with you until the end, because I want to know that you're here, that Jake's promise resonated with you, that you recognized the difference between the performative strength we maintain for years and the true strength that comes from allowing oneself to be fully seen. Your comments tell me that it's worth investing in exploring the nuances of how trauma can both destroy and reveal, how forced isolation can create intimacy that years of normality could never achieve, how a promise made on a bathroom floor can mean more than 1,000 declarations of love made in comfortable moments. And if this touched you in some way, you recognized your own breakdown in a moment of it. If you saw a reflection of someone who held you when you were fragmented. If you understood that choosing vulnerability with the right person is a more profound act of courage than maintaining strength alone, leave a like so I know. It's not about numbers. It's about knowing. that what I create reaches you on the other side and touches something real. Something that makes you think about your own promises, about the people who held you, about the difference between being alone and allowing yourself not to be. And because I know you don't want this story to end here. Because stories like this demand a continuation. Demand to see if a promise made in vulnerability survives the test of reality. If love born in isolation endures when the world returns with all its complications. There's a video over here that continues in the same vein. Click and follow me there. Until the next chapter.